Good afternoon. We're going to be talking about ADHD today. And I'm going to try to uncover some of the unknown truths about ADHD, given a different perspective. Now, what we're going to cover first is we're going to go into an introduction. What is ADHD? Where did it come from? What is the doctor's perspective? What's the teacher's perspective? Then we're going to move into living with ADHD and addictive substances. And then we're finally going to come to a conclusion with different solutions that I have found and that I have used to coach others. So go ahead and keep listening. We're going to jump right into the introduction. So what I'd like to discuss today is what it's like to live with ADHD. Now, I'm not a doctor. I have to tell you that up front. I just happen to be somebody who has been studying psychology for over 10 years, has over 12,000 hours of relevant experience. I pretty much eat, sleep, and breathe psychology in everything that I do. And I have been living with ADHD for my entire life. Thankfully, it was misdiagnosed when I was younger. Otherwise, I might be on medications, which would limit my abilities. Now, here's the truth about ADHD. It is not necessarily a disability, it is a condition. So when they call it a disability, or a disorder, or something of that nature, that's not the case. I can tell you this from experience because I've coached other people with ADHD on how to manage it and how to utilize it as an asset. What happens with an ADHD brain is, I want you to imagine the newest i7 computer out there. You know, the 6-core and all that. And it's running all sorts, and imagine it running at full speed. And that's what one of our brains is like. Because while I'm talking to you right now, I am picturing in my head previous times when I've dealt with adversity because of my ADHD. I am thinking psychologically about the different effects of ADHD. I'm planning out what I'm trying to say to you. And I'm also thinking about the different arguments that somebody would have with me if they were to be sitting right next to me. And I'm planning all this stuff out inside my head. I'm also listening to a song in my head. So that's kind of how an ADHD mind works. We are multitaskers. And one asset that I personally have is I happen to notice trends. I mean, I could see puzzles piecing together. When I was very young, they gave me these blocks with 6 sides. You know, of course, blocks have 6 sides. And they would give me this shape on a piece of paper, and then within less than 2 seconds, I would flip those blocks, and I would turn them into the shape that I saw on paper. Keep in mind, this could be up to 12 blocks, and I was only in 3rd grade. In fact, it was borderline. It was right before the border of autism in the speed in which I could do that. And a lot of ADHD people are like this. I want you to think about the movie Fast and the Furious. You remember that one tweaky little dude that he said the only thing that calms him down is engines? And working on engines? That's not too far from an ADHD mind. We are able to think on a level that a lot of people would have trouble doing. It would take practice and training to do. But on the flip side, when it comes to focusing on single tasks, few things will put us to sleep more than focusing on one person or one book, because we're not built to run in that fashion. We're not built to focus on just one thing. I want you to imagine this. You got that 6-core computer, right, going at full speed. Now imagine it only doing one task. It's going to burn itself out. It's got all this extra electricity pumping into it, and the electricity is saying, okay, we're going to make you run faster. And it's only focusing on one thing, so it's just putting all of its energy in there, and it's basically like an electric motor without any resistance. It's going to spin out, burn out, overheat, and then it's going to hit that fuse, and it's going to say, okay, we need to tone this down. And that's why after a long monotonous day in a call center or in a sales job where you're doing the same thing over and over and over again, an ADHD person needs to have some sleep. Like, they'll come home and they'll crash. They won't want to do anything else. Well, maybe they'll want to do something else, but first and foremost, they'll need to crash and hit the reset button. And that's because with ADHD, you're always going at full speed. Now, where this comes in with parents, and keep in mind, most parents, they mean well. Okay? But where this comes in with parents is you've got these kids in classrooms. And one thing that I remember hearing from different students that I used to tutor kindergarten through 4th grade. And I've spoken to a lot of ADHD people that were on medication later on, but they would tell me when they were back in grade school and high school, and some of them early college before they got on medication, is that they would get really bored with classes and they would get distracted because the classes were too easy. Remember when I say it was like a brain moving at hyper speed? Well, we learn very quickly, and we learn better from multiple stimuli. So ADHD, Attention Deficit Hyperactive Disorder. How did doctors come up with that name? Well, let's look at how doctors create names for diseases or conditions or that type of deal. But before I go into that, I want you to consider something. If you've never been drunk, can you really tell somebody what being drunk feels like? So, what these doctors did is they noticed that there were these adults and children that were different from everybody else. What was happening was they were in classrooms or in different situations where they needed to pay attention, and obviously they weren't paying as much attention as other people. They were sitting in their chairs, kind of squirming around. They were doing other things, and this became a known trait. And so what they did was they looked at the correlation and the different mannerisms that these individuals held, and they started noticing a trend. And where it branched off from there is they isolated each one of these individuals, found different correlations in their own personal lives, and eventually came up with a name for what they call a disorder, which I personally don't consider it a disorder. I consider it an asset, but like all assets, it has to be managed. And if you want to get technical, it's a condition, because it's not a disease, it's not a disorder. That's just what they thought at the time. Now, as far as the hyperactive goes, I want you to think about a dog. I had a key sound. And key sounds, what they are is they're very lovable dogs, and they're very high energy. And if you don't give them enough energy, enough attention, if they don't get to go outside and if they can't be around their masters long enough, what they do is they start chasing their tails and causing other types of mischief. And that's because they're letting their master know, I've got tons of energy inside me, I need to let it out. Well, humans are very much the same way. And when an ADHD person is forced to sit in a chair and do one solid thing for an extended period of time, what ends up happening is that person gets pent-up energy. And that's why, even as I'm talking to you right now, I've always got my foot moving or something else is moving, just because we don't like to sit still. We are very interactive, we are very spontaneous people, we are constantly moving. So that's kind of where the hyperactive came from, is they saw that these individuals were considered hyperactive. They were constantly going in their own personal lives outside of a scholastic or professional setting. And so they came up with the concept of attention deficit hyperactive disorder. Now, where disorder came in, and I know I'm going to get some controversy off of this, but doctors tend to have a bit of an ego, and that's not necessarily undeserved. Certainly they've put 8 years into studying their profession, and then they've spent another 4 years of residency, and then they've got their own practice, or they're working for another practice, or within a hospital. So, I mean, that's one of the longest tenures before actually jumping into your career full bore out of any of the professions out there. Doctors are true professionals, and they've certainly earned a certain level of, I guess you might call it ego, but they've earned their kudos. They have, and what ends up happening with this is, instead of automatically assuming that somebody has an asset if they're not paying attention, or thinking that they might, imagining that that person might be able to think faster and that they're bored with classes, what they notice are the deficits. They're not paying attention, and they're always hyperactive at home. So they automatically assume if there's something different about a person, or a lot of doctors automatically assume if there's something different, then it is related to a disorder. And so that's where you get the concept of attention deficit hyperactive disorder. And it's kind of a great shame, because I don't view it as a disorder, it is a condition. For example, if you're short, that is a condition of life. Okay, if you're short, that means you're not going to be able to reach the top shelf unless you get a stool, or unless you get help. But at the same time, a short person has assets that a tall person doesn't. For example, a short person might be able to fit into tighter spaces, or might be able to see things from a different perspective that a tall person wouldn't. And that's kind of where ADHD comes in here. We see things differently. One thing that I've noticed as a correlation with people that are ADHD is when it comes to mathematics or science, they have a strong propensity for reverse engineering. In fact, that's something that got me marked off regularly on math, because I would reverse engineer problems. I would get them 100% correct, but I wouldn't use the method that instructors told me to use, and I was thus marked off because I obviously must be wrong. And that's the perception that people have, is they automatically think that there's something wrong with somebody if they're different, versus what if they're smarter. Imagining somebody else as smarter or thinking faster or thinking on a different level or different scale than an average person, and viewing something like that as an asset, that goes against, I guess you might call it egotistical principles. An average person does not want to view somebody else as better than them. I know that's a hard truth, but it is a truth. And very few psychologists will actually argue with me on that. And those few that do, well, I mean, they kind of fall in that category, don't they? So, moving on, what is a doctor's perspective on this condition? Well, naturally, doctors want to cure whatever they view as a disorder. And so what doctors did is they worked on different solutions. And let's focus on how doctors actually treat diseases or treat conditions or treat disorders. What they do is they look at all the symptoms. Because I'm here to tell you, for several millennia, doctors, they work with guesswork. And the reason being is, like I mentioned a few minutes ago, they're not in the shoes of their patient. And so what ends up happening is they have to take information from that patient about their symptoms and then associate it with something else in order to come up with a disease. And then once they come up with a disease and they understand the symptoms, then they use different methods for treating those symptoms, generally relative to methods that work for similar symptoms with other diseases, disorders, or conditions. And it's guesswork. It's all guesswork. But it's an educated guess. And so what happens with ADHD is they've eventually figured out that by using stimulants, they are able to slow down the brain of an ADHD person. And so what ends up happening with that is they give different stimulants which speed up an ADHD brain, which has the reverse effect. It actually slows it down. I guess you might think of it as taking it over the top, so the brain has to lower its functioning speed. And so these doctors, they look at it as a disorder, and their natural response is to assign pharmaceuticals, because that is the easiest method for treating this, according to what's been discovered thus far. And that's true. It is the easiest method. But easiest is not always best, and we're going to discuss that in a few minutes. One thing to note is doctors are well-intended. In general, they are very well-intended, they mean well, and I'm not knocking anybody on this. It's just, it's, again, a shame that things haven't been corrected, that this isn't being treated as a condition, and other options aren't being explored, because obviously these people are having such wonderful effects by having their brains slow down that there's no need to explore other options. And unfortunately, with the medical field, that happens fairly often. And then once in a while, there will be somebody that goes against the grain, that comes up with a different solution, and these doctors all of a sudden say, hey, yeah, you're crazy, but good luck to you. And then when that person actually comes out with a solution, they're still ostracized to a certain degree, but eventually that solution will be recognized, unless it's just completely groundbreaking and shatters all myths. So, and that's what we're going to try to do here, is we're going to bring up some different solutions in order for an ADHD person to have another option besides medication or just doing it cold turkey. Now let me give the teacher's perspective on this. Teachers are taught that ADHD is a disorder. It's something that psychologists came up with, and the teachers have to recognize because they have to go by what psychologists teach. I mean, they're psychologists and they're teachers, two completely different fields. Okay. So when we look at the teacher's perspective, they're taught that, okay, this student has a disorder and they should be on medication. And that's, what the teacher will recommend is go see a psychologist, and that psychologist will teach the parents that yes, the student needs to be on medication. Now, what isn't considered is the rapid learning pace at which ADHD students engage different subject matter. For example, mathematics and science. I learned at a highly accelerated rate, and so did many of the other ADHD people that I've encountered over the years. But when it comes to reading, reading's pretty monotonous. It's something that can be easily acquired if the brain is conditioned to learn at a rapid pace. In other areas, perhaps that student, just like anybody else, may not be gifted in that area. But what teachers notice with ADHD, getting back on subject, is the ADHD student is identified by a student that constantly does not focus to the teacher's lecture or to the board during class. They're doodling, they're doing other things. It's hard for a student to sit still. And that is because of the pent-up energy of ADHD. When we're sitting still, again, referencing back to the electric motor, we're in hyperdrive and we're trying to get rid of that energy. And I'll give a reference to, I used to own a key sound, and no, I'm not comparing children to key sounds, but that is a dog that if you don't give it personal attention and if it doesn't have the opportunity to run, what it will do is to get rid of the excess energy that it has, and to demonstrate that it has excess energy, it will run around in circles, chase its tail, and it will sometimes kind of grind into the ground. It will grind into the carpet and cause other forms of mischief. It's why dogs sometimes chew shoes. They want more attention, they want more exercise, they want to get rid of that excess energy. And that's why a lot of students will be running around, will constantly be moving in their seats. In fact, as I'm speaking to you right now, my leg is moving. And that's just because I have pent-up energy, sitting in one place, talking in front of a camera for a prolonged period of time, doing multiple takes. That is taxing on somebody that's ADHD. So we have to get rid of our energy elsewhere. Another factor that will be identified with ADHD is a lesser known factor, or a lesser recognized factor, is the student can learn certain things at a very rapid pace. Some ADHD students will be put into an accelerated learning program, which is exactly what happened to me, thank God. But ADHD students, because they can learn at a rapid pace, they need multiple stimuli. And that's why they're doodling. That's why they're taking notes, that's why they're doing other things. They might be humming, they might be listening to music. And that's not necessarily taking away from their ability to learn, but in the teacher's perspective, because they've been taught traditionally from textbooks, and textbooks teach that ADHD is a disorder and here's how you spot it, that's why teachers take on the perspective of, okay, ADHD is something that needs to be corrected, and if it's not being corrected, well, that's the parent's fault. And I'm not saying all teachers are like this, but some, that's what they're taught. And keep in mind, most teachers have the right intentions in mind. It's just they're learning from a textbook. So, what causes ADHD? Nobody knows. Doctors can claim one thing or the other, but right now nobody knows. There are a lot of theories going around there. In fact, I'm going to voice one of my theories with you. You can take it or leave it, grant it merit, or blow it off. Doesn't really matter to me. Hopefully it matters to you, though. So, first, children's programming. Children at an early developmental age have an attention span of about 5 seconds, the same as a dog. And there's going to be some people that are going to say, oh, he compared children to dogs. No, I didn't do that. Get over it. But children's programming is programmed in a way that's going to maintain their attention spans over a half-hour period, which means color, color, new movement, new thing, exciting, faces, color, constantly for half an hour. So these children are getting multiple stimuli on a regular basis, and parents are more and more drawing their children to television. Schools are giving children much more television. And television is geared in order to get higher ratings to make people watch longer. Go figure. And so one aspect of it is children are being exposed during their early developmental stages, the most important stages of their life, to multiple stimuli, in which case later on in life their brains have come to expect multiple stimuli. It's already preconditioned for that, predisposed. And then the next aspect is, I don't know, if you may want to research this yourself just to verify I'm being honest here. But immunizations, back when I would have been a kid, contained mercury. And they didn't just contain mercury. They contained more mercury than an adult could process, much less a child. And what mercury does that is very unique is it kills nerve cells. Now, for those of you that aren't aware, our brains are fat and nerve cells. And the nerve cells are connected by dendrites, and different chemicals are flowing between them, so on and so forth. But basically it's fat and nerve cells. That's all it is. And the fat is meant to insulate the nerve cells so that, for example, trauma, like if we get hit in the head, those nerve cells won't die. Just like our skin cells will bruise, we don't really want our brain cells doing that because that's how we operate and think. So you've got this excess mercury in these young kids, and it is affecting brain cells. And here's my personal theory. We have natural inhibitors that slow our thought processes. So for example, you have thought here, they must connect, but they go through this third cell in the middle that may not be directly related to that thought, or maybe, you know, a cross-reference. And so perhaps this third cell gets killed. And I want you to imagine that over all the brain cells, like certain ones get killed. And these two thoughts still need to connect, but they don't have this middle one in between. So instead of going through this middle one, which is absent, they reform connections to connect with each other. And what the middle one does is it slows it down, so now that they're connecting with each other, they're working at a faster speed, and they're acquiring that faster speed. So to slow down is considered abnormal for those two connections. And now just imagine that over an entire brain of billions and billions of cells, if not trillions. And then you've got what we eat. Now, to put into perspective what we eat, look at the water bottle that you have possibly in your fridge or the next time you go to a store. Look at that water bottle. That plastic bottle usually contains estrogen, and it leaks out in very minute amounts into the actual water. But estrogen is one of those unique chemicals that causes imbalance in our emotions. So we have a steady stream of estrogen. If we drink bottled water or anything that's in plastic jugs, we have a steady stream, a minute but steady stream of estrogen leaking into our bodies. And that's just one example. If you look at our foods, even the organic stuff isn't really organic anymore. And to kind of give some perspective here, you've got GMOs now which are not identified, and you've got these different foods that are processed. Our bread is processed. Our canned foods are processed. You've got nitrates. You've got sodium. You've got all sorts of different chemicals that most people can't identify or don't know the origins of. They just know that those chemicals are there if they ever read the label. And organic now can have certain pesticides, I think. They've really lowered the bar on what's considered organic, thanks to the FDA and other organizations. But this food that we're eating has side effects, and that also contributes to chemical imbalances, which our brain runs on chemicals. Excess serotonin, likelihood of depression. Excess dopamine, likelihood of euphoria or illusions of grandeur. So little imbalances here and there offset us. They change us. They change how we think, our thought patterns. And at an early age, especially with the crap foods that we give our kids. For example, we take a box of what says macaroni and cheese, which is, you've got the macaroni, which is pasta. God knows what goes into it. Then you've got this powder that we call cheese, which tastes like cheese, but very little of it comes from an actual cow. And we're feeding these to kids. Well, it's no wonder if some developmental challenges come up later on in life, or these kids are looking like they're older because they're not getting the proper nutrients that people 50 years ago did. Because 50 years ago they didn't have all these preservatives, they grew stuff from the ground, and it was fresh from the ground to your mouth half the time. At least that's the case with my mother. So it's something to consider. I believe it's all of these factors together which derive ADHD children. But again, I'm not a doctor. I'm just somebody that's ADHD that studies psychology for over 10 years and is practically obsessed with psychology. So take it or leave it. So here's a good one for you. How does ADHD affect us in society? How does it affect our relationships with other people? This is a really personal one, but I'm going to give personal information and hopefully it will help other people with ADHD. Alright. We are rapid thinkers, and we're normally eclectic, often very eccentric. Many of us will speak rapidly, and we will speak in circles. And what that means is when we're engaging somebody and when we're speaking to them, we will talk about this subject over here, and because our brains are thinking, okay, this relates to that, we're going to jump to this subject. And people may not necessarily follow our thought process, because when we go to this subject, we're thinking, okay, it relates to this subject. And this also ties into the first subject, so let's talk about this. And let's bring this up for consideration and maybe put a little background information to it. And so we got this one subject we're talking about over here, and then this leads into this subject, and this leads into this subject, which all ties back into the very first one. So we talk in circles. And often we'll come around back to the point. It may take a long period of time, but we know where we're headed, and our brains are thinking on such a high degree, considering all of the different branches off of that central topic, that's generally what happens. For example, when I'll be speaking to somebody, and it's let's say we're talking about comedy. Well, a certain phrase could coin off to me a certain comedian, and then from there, in an instant, in the blink of an eye, I'll automatically think of, this comedian did this, and I remember that show, and in that show was this, and then I'll automatically want to quote what they said in that show, that comedian, given that phrase, which does not directly relate to this quote, but that phrase that the person just said, it's what brings about that thought process that takes us all the way up to here. And it takes practice and a certain level of focus to be able to get us to where we need to where we can communicate effectively to other people in a social environment with relationships. I hate to say it like this, but I was at my best when I had multiple girlfriends, and that's because it was a constant juggling act. But that's kind of how we are. We like multiple stimuli, and physical aspects ground us. For example, intimacy, touch, those types of things are what grounded me, and that's why for a while that's all I was seeking, just like any other guy, but for a different reason. While they were seeking gratification, I was seeking it for balance. And it's hard for a lot of people to imagine that or see it from that perspective, just because they haven't necessarily lived it. And I'm not saying that you watching this can't. I know that people with ADHD will be able to relate to what I'm talking about. But we see things in a different light. And for example, touch and intimacy, those center us because we're focused on ourselves, on the experience, but we're also focused on what the other person is doing. And it allows us to centralize our focus without wearing us out. It's an amazing experience, especially the first time through. And I'll give you another example of an ADHD quirk in life. There's a game called WoW, World of Warcraft. WoW is just the acronym for it. But it is a video game that was built to be addictive. And we are naturally addicted to video games. Why? Because they present multiple stimuli in rapid succession, and a certain interaction with either the video game or other people playing the video game. It's why Counter-Strike, when it first came out, was hugely popular with us. Because we're having to focus on other players, we're having to focus on the environment, we're going to have to focus on what we're doing. And people with ADHD, the reason we can play video games that are intense for so long is those games are at our level. Whereas they would increase the adrenaline and cause a normal person to run at a rapid speed, because the different lights, the different flashes, they're designed to make people kind of feel a consistent adrenaline rush or a consistent dopamine rush. For us, it's like every day. You know, that would be an everyday task to an average person. That's video games to us. We can do it for hours upon hours upon hours, and again, it's a balancer. And that's partly why I personally avoid video games now. I recognize that they are addictive. One other aspect that is addictive to a lot of ADHD people is when we get burnt out from thinking fast all the time, every day, all day. When we get tired of being consistently burnt out, what some people will turn to is non-pharmaceutical drugs, which in some cases could be marijuana. In some cases it could be nicotine. Drinking, not so much. Drinking actually speeds us up a little bit, but it's an emotional balancer. But yes, nicotine is highly addictive for us because it slows us down. Whereas it accelerates other people, because it accelerates other people, it slows our brains down, because I guess you could say it pushes our brains over the edge and then brings us back down again. It would be hard to explain it more than that without taking, an hour of your time to just explain that, how drugs interact with an ADHD brain. But know that things that speed normal people up slow us down. Another factor to consider is most jobs, entry level or lower level, are monotonous. And that's, all the way to managing a store or whatnot. until you get into the executive level where you focus on multiple things at once, and you have to take in a wider and broader perspective with narrow details. Monotonous jobs, for example, a call center, those can get very, very tedious for us. That's just because we have to sit in a chair for a prolonged period of time, and we have to focus on one person and solving their issue. And we have to take into consideration, we have to change our mannerisms too to be amenable to that person, so that that person feels better about speaking with us and feels better about the company. So we're sitting in a chair, we're saying the same thing over and over again to assure people, and we're doing the same task over and over again, just slightly different by person. That will wear us out, and at the end of the day, the only thing that an ADHD person will do if working in a call center is probably crash or engage into something that's going to present multiple stimuli, such as a video game. Same thing with college and different courses that we'll take. In college, you have to focus on an instructor for a prolonged period of time if you're in the traditional class setting. And then you have to focus on that instructor, take down notes. Okay, great. And then you go home, you read a book, and you have to write these long papers on stuff that has already settled into our minds. So these papers are to prove to the professor that we've learned what we've learned. But these papers often take a long period of time, which is why many of us will put them off, or we will go to them, play a game, go back, play a game. 15 minutes, an hour. 15 minutes, an hour. That's how we work many times. Quite often, excuse me. And I've spoken to plenty of people with ADHD that go through this. And because of the challenges represented in traditional jobs and traditional scholastic settings, many of us will drop out or get fired from a job or step away from a job or step away from college because of the challenge it represents to our quality of life. Because once we're burnt out at the end of the day, we'll crash for several hours, and then we'll wake up in the middle of the night and stay up until it's time to do it all over again, and then loathe the fact that we have to do it all over again. It's very challenging. It was very challenging for me, even with the level of focus that I learned at a young age. Being able to focus on multiple different things at once and balance my ADHD to a degree, it was still challenging to be in those types of jobs, to be in sales jobs, to have worked in call centers, even to have managed stores and managed multiple employees. It was still monotonous and tedious. So let's take a peek at the solution. What is the solution here? Well, for some people it is medications. I personally will never ever use medications. And the reason being is doctors, unless they run a specific test that can determine a specific bacterium, virus, condition, then it's all guesswork. What they do is, and this is not to knock doctors because this has been a practice for millennia. They take a symptom here, a symptom there, and a symptom there, based off of the limited information that a patient can give them. And then they say, okay, it can be this, 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 or this. Now, this is the most likely cause, so we're going to lean on this for now. And if what we use to cure this doesn't help, then we'll lean on the second most common or the third most common. Or we'll run another test to see, well, it might have been this other thing that we didn't think it was. That's how doctors work, because they can't experience what's going on with different diseases. They aren't in the patient's shoes. And a lot of times they have never been in the patient's shoes. I mean, if it's a cold, flu, yes. If it's something more severe like cancer or whatnot, they usually can't fit in the patient's shoes, so they have to interpret what the patient gives them and then fit it to a list of symptoms and fit those list of symptoms to diseases. And when they prescribe medications, you'll notice that they start off with lighter dosages and then work their way up. And then they'll say, okay, we're going to try this one. And if this drug doesn't work, we're going to go to this drug. And it's funny, with ADHD, they don't know where it comes from. And so what they're doing is they're pumping different chemicals into the brain to slow the brain down. And they have different methods of slowing it down. This may get a little confusing here, but if you speed a fast brain up, it's going to slow down. For example, when I drink, I speed up. Or when I used to drink, I don't drink anymore. When I drink, I speed up. When I was on coffee, I slowed down. When I consume a lot of sugar, I slow down almost immediately. And that's because our brains work kind of in reverse, or at least with certain chemicals we do. Some chemicals we work perfectly normally. And so what doctors do is they give chemicals that speed up the brain, which causes the brain to slow down. Again, I know it's a little confusing, but that's how it works. And I don't have time to go into all the nuances of it. But doctors, they go off guesswork, and they give these different chemicals that try to counterbalance what the brain is doing. Basically, it forces the brain to slow down, speed up, blah, blah, blah. But it doesn't actually cure the present condition. So it's treating the symptoms instead of actually attacking the what they consider to be a disease. Well, I'm here to tell you, all it is just a very fast brain. So what is the cure to ADHD? Well, the cure is to stay busy. Now, the way that I've been able to do it, and I've taught other people to do it, is our brains need to focus on multiple things at once. And most people, when they meet me and they see me in a professional environment, they'll never guess. They will not know that I'm ADHD except for the fact that something is always moving. My leg is always moving, or my hand's always twirling something or moving around. But I'm only moving one part of my body at a time, the rest of it focused. But the cure is to engage your mind. Now, I was fortunate enough to just have a natural propensity for meditation. And what I develop my mind into is at all times of the day. Doesn't matter what part of the day it is. I think even when I'm sleeping sometimes, I will always have a song playing in my head. I will always be planning out what I'm going to do next. So I'm always thinking ahead. If I'm around other people, I'm always thinking about what are they thinking. It's part of what got me into psychology. I'm always wondering what they're thinking and trying to anticipate their next move. I'm trying to anticipate their arguments. And the last part of my brain is engaged into whatever task is moving my body. Whether it is, playing an instrument or driving a car, so on and so forth, it's intently focused. For example, when I am talking to somebody, listening to music on the radio, singing along with it off to the side, like between conversations, and driving, I can hit a speed bump while I'm engaged in a deep conversation, all that other good stuff, and the people in the car will barely feel the speed bump. Why? Because I know when to hit the gas, when to let off the gas, in order to make that speed bump seem like it's not there, or it's barely there. And that all rolls into keeping our mind engaged. For somebody that is ADHD, this is my recommendation. Now follow these steps, because these steps are what I've used to guide a lot of people into living more productive lives with ADHD. First, dark room with a single light. It doesn't have to be a candle, because that can actually hurt your eyes. But a dark room with a single light somewhere. I don't care if it's a piece of light bleeding through a crack in the wall, I don't care. What you do is you focus on that single point, and you try to quiet your thoughts. You try to focus on not thinking anything, not even thinking that you're not thinking of anything. And really, take your time, be patient, and focus on that. You'll find that it takes a lot of your attention. It will put you to sleep a few times, so I do recommend doing it at night because it's going to make you very tired. But start doing that, and do that for a couple months until you can master just focusing on that single speck of light and blanking out everything else. You may not achieve that level, but give it a shot. And then after a couple months, what you're going to do is start singing a song and doing math. Focus on doing both of those at the same time. Meaning, one half of your brain is singing a song or hearing music in your head, the other half is doing math. And then once you can achieve that, which, believe it or not, to do both of those coherently and isolate both sides, it's not the easiest thing in the world to do. It may sound like, okay, I can do that. No. To have both of those running at full bore, to where you're focusing on the music and you're focusing on the math, not easy. And then what you do is you focus on, you plan out your next day. So when you've mastered getting both of those down, then you add a third one in, you focus on planning your day. Now, if you want to add on a fourth level and think of something else while you're doing it, maybe try to remember into your past while you're doing everything else. That's up to you if you want to push your brain that hard. Once you do that, your IQ is going to skyrocket if you can pull off four at a time. But it's also something that you have to maintain. 3, that's going to follow you for the rest of your life. 2, absolutely. But if you can do that, then what's going to happen in your daily life, and you're going to have to, it's going to take a little practice and a little bit of training, but what's going to happen in your daily life is when you get comfortable working with 3, then you'll be able to use them, you'll be able to do that throughout your entire day. And while one part over here is just imagining and one part is listening to music, one part can be focused solely on the task at hand, and you're not going to get burnt out by the end of the day, or at least not as much. And so you keep your mind occupied here, you keep occupied here, maybe you're drawing, and then this. So it's not easy. I'm going to tell you up front, it is not easy. It takes a good amount of focus, and it takes patience, something we are not known for. But if you can take that time and focus, you'll develop your patience to another level, which will help train your brain to be able to endure longer periods. Like part of the reason for the light and the focus on the singular light and quieting all your thoughts is to build up your endurance for being able to do a monotonous task for a longer period of time. It builds up your endurance, and then once you focus on those different areas, it allows those cores of your brain to be spread out more thinly, instead of focused on one thing and burning out your motor. And that's one of the better solutions that I've found than medications. But again, I'm not a doctor. I have to disclose that for legal reasons. And I'm not your doctor. I am not you. I can only speak from my own experience and how I've helped other people get over this. Because it can be an asset. So how can you tutor somebody that has ADHD? Well, this is something I dealt with at a younger age. I was still I was in college at the same time I was in high school, and I was tutoring children, kindergarten through 4th grade. And there are 3 types of learning. There's auditory, visual, and kinesthetic. Now, your average person, they learn best through all 3 methods, with a special focus on one. But if you give them all 3 methods, their ability for retention is significantly increased. With ADHD, what I have found in my own personal experience, and something that I use when I tutor, college students now, which I tutor bachelor's and master's level students. If you can isolate the primary learning method of an ADHD or OCD or ADD student, you can exploit that. For example, I am an auditory learner. So I have a very high retention rate for things that I hear. And I have a secondary learning method of visual. So kinesthetic, the hands-on type of deal, that's not so much my forte, but auditory, huge. Visual, it's a secondary. It's not what I learn best with, but it helps. Now with people that are ADHD, for example, somebody like me, what teachers would want to focus on, what professors probably wouldn't, but what teachers will want to focus on is teaching that student, like me, from an auditory perspective. So teaching more lessons verbally and then allowing that student to engage in their secondary learning method, whether it is visualizing the board or visualizing the teacher, focusing on the teacher's mouth moving or their different mannerisms, or even just letting them draw, which drawing is a mixture of kinesthetic and visual. But allowing them to engage their secondary method, even if that method is not directly related to the subject at hand. That is the method that I've found works best with ADHD students. So let's say an ADHD student, and this is relating back to an actual student of mine that I had who was in 2nd grade. Very bright young gentleman. And he was a visual learner with a secondary kinesthetic. So he would learn best by seeing, and then he liked to get his hands dirty. So he'd like to get his hands on whatever it is that we're doing. So what we would do for some of our practice sessions is he would look at the actual workings of the problem as I worked them out, and then he would work them out himself afterwards. It sounds pretty generalized, right? But
scan has been completed.
Yeah, scan has been completed. I'm sorry about the interruption. But he would be able to view things and then would just automatically do them. And if you can isolate that, or for example, if you have a doer, a kinesthetic learner, somebody that needs to be hands-on, if you can isolate their primary method of learning, then you can exploit that. You can increase their learning potential to much higher than an average student just by finding out and identifying what their learning method is and then exploiting that, teaching them at a higher level on that specific focus. And I'll give you a great example from my own perspective. When I took they have standardized learning tests, which we're all familiar with. I personally don't believe in them to a degree, but I somewhat do. Yes and no. But I scored off the charts, 100% on listening skills. 100%. Which was in contrast to a lot of my homework assignments, and I tell you, my mother did not believe it. I mean, when she saw that, she did not believe what she was looking at, because I would sometimes tune her out, selective hearing. But, I mean, that goes to prove I am an auditory learner. And once I saw that myself, I started trying to listen more to what was being taught versus taking notes or doing anything else. I was listening. And then I was visualizing and watching the teacher intently. And I didn't know what I was doing at the time, but I was actually increasing my ability to learn because I was focusing on my primary, and then my secondary was engaged as well. I was focusing on the lip movement of the teachers and the instructors and the professors. One professor had a very unique manner of speaking. but he also was like borderline almost a cleft lip. And it gave me something to focus on visually that wasn't directly related to the task at hand. But it stimulated me. But I was able to focus on what the teachers were saying. So if you're a teacher or if you're a parent and you want your student to learn and they're ADHD, isolate. Take the time to isolate how they learn best. And you can find different tests and methods online, or you can even talk to a psychologist. They'll tell you how to do it. Any psychologist should know how to do this. So let me outline a little bit of self-medication that sometimes ADHD people use. We do have addictive personalities for certain types of stimuli. For example, video games, we can become very addicted to them. Again, it's like being normal. But something that people with ADHD should consider is, for example, nicotine and marijuana. Now, what nicotine does is it's an accelerant. It speeds us up, which ends up slowing us down, same as many of the drugs that doctors use. And we can take nicotine in higher dosages than a standard person, or at least we'll slowly adapt to reach that point, because we're going to be using it just like another person might use cocaine. It's the same type of effect, where you have to keep using more and more to get the same effect. And the same thing with marijuana, but not to such a high degree. When it comes to marijuana, that's a very unique drug in that it slows everybody down. And with ADHD people, what it will do to us is it will slow us down to the point where we can only think compared to all the streams that we have. We could have a stream here, 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 and 8 different streams of information going into and out of our brains, 16 streams, doesn't matter. Well, what it does is it cuts it down to 2, maybe 3, and it shortens the length of those information streams or those thought processes for us. And that can become addictive. It's one of those drugs that people with ADHD should definitely avoid, just because 1, it is illegal, and 2, it is not, I wouldn't say it is chemically addictive, but it is psychologically addictive to us. It is a balancer, and with folks that are ADHD, psychologically we seek balance. And we seek to slow our brains down at times just because it's not always easy being ADHD. So I want to throw that out there as a consideration for those listening, especially those with ADHD. Try to avoid addictive video games, try to avoid nicotine, and try to avoid marijuana. Now I'm going to summarize with this. Living with ADHD unmedicated is not easy. It's not easy by a long shot. And it's not a route that everybody can take. I can tell you that every day is a challenge for me. My mind is constantly focused on all the different avenues of life, all the different things that I want to do, but there's always a section of my mind focused on the fact that I am ADHD. And it is always seeking balance. It is always seeking to kind of round me out, make sure that I keep certain things in check. And that's part of how I balance my ADHD. It's active. My mind is active in multiple different directions, in multiple dimensions. And that's not for everybody. Some people want to take an easier route in life. It's the same way that some people are content making 25 grand a year. Some people are only content if they're making $50 million a month. You know, that type of deal. And I want you to choose what's best for you. Or if you have somebody that you're responsible for that has ADHD, I want you to choose what is going to be best for them in the long term. And I don't say that to knock medications at all. I'm not saying that my method is best. I'm saying that the choice should be presented. If you're responsible for somebody, giving them the choice and giving them an unbiased choice fully laying out the different options and letting them choose is often the best course. Because I believe I've said this before, but you'd be surprised, even if you're speaking to a child, the coherence of children. They may not know how to say what they want to say, but they know what they want to say. And it's just a matter of learning to interpret them. If you have ADHD yourself, and you're not sure which route to go, I would encourage you to try and explore this a little bit more. Don't view it as a disability. Try to view it as a gift, at least for a period of time. And just hold out a little bit longer on the medications. And then try the different methods that I've outlined here. It's not easy. It's by no means easy. Every day is a struggle for me. But thankfully, as time progressed, it got easier and easier. And now what once was a struggle is now just everyday life for me. Half the time I don't have to think about it too hard. I mean, yes, that part of my brain is always going, and it's almost like if a punch is flying at you and you've trained for that punch so many times that you automatically know to block or catch it, or pull a Bruce Lee on it. It's just an automatic reaction. It's the same thing with my ADHD. I've been balancing it for so long that it's automatic now. And I think it's such a higher level than a lot of people I know. And I have such a talent for noticing correlations, and so do many ADHD people out there. We have a natural talent and affinity for certain tasks that exceeds the abilities of your average person. And it comes natural to us. For example, I'm an auditory learner, and I have a very keen, I can hear very well, we'll put it that way. To the point where I can hear a choir, and I can isolate a single voice and tell you if it's on key or off key. Same thing with smaller orchestras. Bigger orchestras, not so much. But smaller orchestras, yes, I can isolate a single instrument and tell you if it's on key, off key. I can hear the entire song played by that single instrument in an orchestra. Same thing with a single voice in a choir. And many of us have these different gifts and abilities. I would encourage you to explore using them. See what your talents are, try the methods that I mentioned, and then if you still feel that you want medication, if that's the route for you, don't feel ashamed of it. That's just what's for you. We're all unique, we're all different, we all have different talents and gifts in life, and we all have different choices to make. And I never want anybody to feel ashamed of any choice that they're making. For a long period of time, I considered medication myself. So, I wish all of you the best, and certainly have happy, great lives. Thank you for listening to me.